Güncel siyaset, kültür, işçi, kadın, çevre, göçmen ve LGBT artı haberleri ve Marksist teori için Marksist.org'u takip edin.
Back in 2011, a whole series of revolutions which shook the Arab world, particularly Egypt and Tunisia, but spread to other countries such as Libya, Syria, with quite varying results and impacts, but certainly these were revolutions. And then last year in 2019, which now seems like an extraordinarily long time ago, there were two revolutions which continued from that in Algeria and Sudan, where the mass of people confronted their existing government and toppled various political dictators. And not only were there two revolutions last year, but there were major revolts that took place in Lebanon, in Chile, in Ecuador, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Catalonia, in France, the strike movement and rebellion that took place there, and so on. I could give you lots of other examples. And these were rebellions that opposed inequality, corruption of the political elite, and lots of other things that were happening in those countries. And some of these had very specific causes. If you look at Catalonia and the independence struggle, or if you look at the fight for democracy in Hong Kong, there are very specific causes of these movements. But there's also general factors driving people to revolt. One of the most important is the way in which the sort of engine of capitalist growth has weakened over recent decades, creating a situation in which for a minority to continue to enrich themselves, they have to squeeze the mass of people harder and harder and institute politics, policies and politics that enshrine their rule through greater and greater corruption and often repression. And these are general factors which are fueling revolt. And as they fuel revolt, they also, by entrenching the rule of this tiny minority, weaken mainstream politics and make it much harder for political leaders to keep people in line. And this paves the way, as we've seen, for all kinds of political explosions, both on the radical right. If you look at countries like America or Brazil or the Philippines or India, you see right-wing political leaders projected to power. But it also, as the revolts of 2019 shows, creates the potential for explosions which at least have the potential to radicalize to the left and leading to a much more progressive and much more socialist challenge to the capitalist order. Not only have these factors driven revolts, but the potential forces available to challenge and confront capitalism are incomparably bigger than they were a few decades ago. We go back to 1848, when Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto with Frederick Engels. He writes in it, workers of the world unite. If you go back to that period, the workers of the world probably amounted to 5 or 10 million people on a global scale. Today, you're talking about a class of wage laborers of something like 2 billion people on a global scale. And these form the sort of raw material for the kind of rebellions that we saw last year. Now, the big rebellions of 2019 were really interrupted, I would say, by COVID-19 and the pandemic. And the immediate impact of the pandemic was to shut down struggles. So people become terrified to protest, quite reasonably, terrified of losing their job and their livelihood. And the impact of the pandemic initially could be to strengthen mainstream politics. So even in Britain, you look at what happened in March of this year, when Boris Johnson announced the lockdown, the immediate impact was to lead to growing popularity for the government. Same in Germany. People like Angela Merkel were strengthened by the lockdown in response to the pandemic initially. I think we can say 6 or 7 months on that that's beginning to change. And now the impact of the pandemic has become another destabilizing factor for global capitalism. The simple fact that under capitalism, in response to the pandemic, the priority is profits over people's lives, has further destabilized mainstream politics. It's also created this cataclysmic economic slump that we're beginning to feel the impact of in Britain, and it's going to get much, much worse in the coming months. Now, over time, the impact of unemployment and economic crisis might demoralize movements, but at the moment, it's radicalizing them. And that's why we're beginning to see around the world a series of new revolts, not yet revolutions, but major revolts taking place. In Lebanon, again, catalyzed by this huge explosion that took place in Beirut port, which has brought people out on the streets in huge numbers in Lebanon. In Thailand, where there's a new revolt against the military, the military regime. In Mali, where the military had to step in to remove the president after mass street protests. In Bolivia, where there's a very impressive general strike and a blockade of the cities to try to reverse the right-wing coup that happened a year ago in Bolivia. And perhaps most dramatically in Belarus, a country about which I think many of us knew very little a few months ago, where we're now seeing a movement against the dictator Lukashenko, which surprisingly takes the form not just of a street movement, but a strike movement in largely state-run factories to oust Lukashenko. And we can add to that the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in America and elsewhere, which has brought people out into the streets in what probably constitute the biggest anti-racist rebellion since the 1960s. Certainly that's the case if you look at America itself. Now, I've been asked not to simply describe these rebellions, but to talk about how you can move from these kind of protest movements into a situation of revolutionary change. Now, first of all, let's be clear, what is a revolution? When I talk about revolution, I mean, yes, large numbers of people protesting and struggling. And yes, I mean something that brings about change in society. But I think something that's very important in revolutions is that they involve a mass confrontation with the state. The masses of people confront the existing state and force through some sort of transformation of society on that basis. Now, there's actually two distinct forms of revolution that you see around the world. First of all, the most common type are what we call political revolutions. And what I mean by a political revolution is that the mass of people rise up, they overthrow some or all of their political leaders, and they bring new leaders to power. It might also involve a transformation of the form of government from dictatorship to parliamentary democracy. If you look at what's happening in Belarus, people want a new kind of political system. They want an end to dictatorship. It can range from the kind of revolution that took place last year in Sudan, which is a very important revolution, but so far it's led to only very limited political change in which the army agreed to share power with some sort of democratically elected government, at least in theory. Whether it actually happens remains to be seen. Or it can be a much more dramatic political transformation, like you saw, for example, in Portugal in 1974, when there was a big revolutionary upheaval, and it essentially ended the military dictatorship in Portugal, instituted parliamentary democracy in the country. Now, these revolutions, political revolutions, are very important because, among other things, they demonstrate the capacity of ordinary people to shape politics through their struggles, and they can lead to genuine improvements in the conditions of ordinary people. If you look at, I don't know, for example, the Bolivian Revolution of 1952, it was a political revolution, but it also led to quite large-scale land reform for the peasantry, changes in labour conditions, and much more radical changes than that. But what these political revolutions don't do is they don't change the fundamental basis according to which society functions. The societies that experience these political revolutions remain capitalist societies. In other words, they remain societies presided over by a small elite who exploit the mass of ordinary people and who engage in a competitive battle over profit-making and the accumulation of capital. So that they're important processes, but they don't lead to this fundamental transformation of society to break capitalism. Ending capitalism, which is the goal of those of us who are in the Socialist Workers' Party, requires something beyond a political revolution. It requires what we call a social revolution. A revolution that breaks the whole logic of capitalism. Now, I'll talk in a moment about that happening under capitalism. It's very important to say, though, that a series of social revolutions brought about capitalist rule, beginning really with the Dutch Revolt of the 16th century, the English Revolution and Civil War of the 17th century, the Great French Revolution in the 18th century, the American War of Independence, and so on. These were sweeping revolutionary processes that broke the power of the old feudal ruling classes, the monarchy, the landowners, and so on, and created the conditions in which capitalist society could flourish. And in order to make these revolutions, the rising capitalist class had to rally behind them, the mass of ordinary people, to break the power of the old feudal rulers and create these conditions in which capitalism could emerge. But as capitalism emerged and cemented itself, people quite rapidly discovered that what had come about was not an end to the oppression they faced, but a new form of exploitative society, capitalism, based on exploitation of wage labour, and so on. Under capitalism, we haven't seen very many of these social revolutions. In fact, I would say we've seen one instance of a social revolution that created the conditions for the overthrow of capitalism and the creation of a socialist society. And that was the Great Russian Revolution that took place in 1917. And it's why socialists still bang on about the Russian Revolution. For all that it was a long, long time ago, it's quite important in our history because it shows for the first time in history the capacity of the working class to rise up and begin to create, after overthrowing the existing state, to begin to create new ways of running society driven democratically from below. Now, of course, by 10 years after the Russian Revolution, that had all been reversed through the international isolation of the Russian Revolution, the civil war that decimated the working class, and then the rise of Stalinism, really on the ashes of this revolution, which reversed all the gains that we made in 1917. But it shows a glimpse of what's possible. And that's why, as I say, we talk about 1917. Now, what I want to talk about for the next sort of 10 minutes in conclusion is what it would mean for the kind of revolts we're seeing at the moment to move in this direction of social revolution. And the first thing I think we have to say is that social revolution needs to elevate the working class majority to a position of a new ruling class. It needs to create a new democratic society in which the working class are in control. And by the working class, I mean the majority who depend for their livelihood on wage labour, along with those broader members of society who are too young to work or unable to work through old age, disability, discrimination, or unemployment. That's what I mean by the working class, that broad layer of people in society. The huge majority in British society, in most societies that we encounter around the world. And it's only once this class have elevated themselves to the ruling class that they can begin to democratically reorganize the economy to determine how best to meet human needs. And I would say it's more obvious now than ever before that capitalism represents a barrier to this. If you look at the pandemic, it's absolutely clear that anything that undermines profit-making is a challenge to the whole capitalist order. And the moment you take profit-making out of the equation, the moment you accept that we're content for the time being to simply share the wealth that we create at the moment, it's relatively easy to see how in the conditions of pandemic you divert resources into meeting basic public needs for health and welfare. But under capitalism, myriad pointless activities such as funneling office workers into pret-a-manger to keep the profits of companies like that going become essential to the functioning of British capitalism. So we need to change all that. Now, why do we need a revolution to change all that? I think the first and most basic reason is that we confront a powerful class of capitalists who don't want us to take from them their ability to pump profits out of workers. So we want to challenge them. We have to mobilize a power in society capable of confronting them effectively. And for us, an essential argument for revolutionary socialists is that workers possess that power. And they possess that power for a very simple reason. Everywhere that capitalism has spread, it's created a working class majority who are responsible for all the basic functioning of society. And again, this is very, very obvious in the pandemic, where the people whose labour is really important are not the entrepreneurs and the Richard Bransons and so on. It's the people who do the basic work that keeps society ticking over, who run supermarkets and hospitals and all the rest of it. So being able to withhold that labour collectively or even direct it to other goals other than profit making is a huge source of power. And not only that, but our common experience as workers, our common interest in ending exploitation can potentially allow us to overcome the petty divisions that we face as a working class, to begin to recognise we have more in common than divides us. Not only that, but capitalism draws us together collectively in cities, in huge workplaces, and it teaches us the power of organisation. If you think about what capitalists do, for all their disorganisation, they also organise us in workplaces. They teach us that organisation is a powerful weapon. And we can begin to recapture that and use that organisation against them. So if you look at the history of capitalism has seen more regular collective revolts from below than any previously existing society. It may feel like people are very passive, but actually if you look at the long history of capitalism, it's a history of revolt and rebellion on a very, very regular basis. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that workers are always in the forefront of rebellion or that workers are always socialist-minded. If you look at some of the revolts that took place in 2019, they don't automatically involve the collective activity of workers. If you look at Hong Kong, for example, there's a huge rebellion against Chinese rule in the region of Hong Kong. But one of the socialist participants in that complained that the people who were actually engaged in the street fighting, mainly young, very heroic protesters, they wanted to see a general strike, but in his words, they treated it like it was an instant noodle, that you could just order it and the waiter would bring it to your table. And the point he was making is, no, it's not automatic that workers run to the head of these struggles. It's something you often have to fight for politically as an orientation. So we have to argue why we want to put workers at the centre of these struggles. Now, the second reason we have to talk about revolution is a very obvious one. You know, whenever you say to people, I'm a revolutionary socialist, they'll say to you, but look, workers are not necessarily socialists. They're not all chomping at the bit to make a revolution. They don't always have progressive ideas. Many of them are racist or sexist and have downright reactionary and lousy ideas a lot of the time. And our response is, of course, is to say that, yes, we understand that workers are neither saints nor devils. They often contain in their heads a complex mixture of progressive and backward ideas. Racism can coexist with anti-racism and lots of other ideas in workers' heads. The point is, it's as workers begin to fight and struggle collectively that they begin to transform their ideas. As Marx put it, they begin to throw off the muck of ages and make themselves fit to rule. It's through our experience of struggle that we begin to recognize how society is run, and we begin to envisage new ways of running society and begin to overcome the backward ideas that we might have in our heads. And you see that whenever you talk to a group of workers in struggle, you begin to recognize the transformation of ideas that comes about. But when you talk to workers who make a revolution, you see this 100-fold. You can look at the examples from Egypt a few years ago, where in the revolution, for a moment at least, all the petty sort of sexist ideas, all the discrimination against religious minorities were dissolved by the huge crowds in squares like Tahrir in Cairo, where you've got groups of Muslim protesters, for example, surrounding Coptic Christians who face horrible oppression by society to defend them whilst they're at prayer, and vice versa when the Muslims were at prayer. You see how revolution can begin to overcome these ideas. Now, as this suggests, revolution is not just an event, it's a process. It's a process of transformation. It's not true that we organize, we win the majority, and then we wake up one fine morning and make a revolution. That's not how revolutions happen. Revolutions begin as spontaneous rebellions from below that occur in moments of revolutionary crisis. And what I mean by that is that they tend to occur when the ruling class reaches some sort of impasse or some sort of crisis it can't easily resolve on the basis of the old way of running society. And the mass of people are no longer content to be ruled in the old way. So if you look at Belarus at the moment, you have this situation in which there's been this fraudulent election in which Lukashenko claims that he's run, and the mass of people are just sick of and tired of this. But, 10 years ago, they might have tolerated it, but the Belarusian economy has been heading deeper and deeper into crisis over the last 10 years, and Lukashenko can't even give people a way of putting food on their table. And so they say it's the hunger, but it's also the lack of democracy. All these kind of things fuel the revolt. And because that society is in a crisis, you begin to see cracks emerging at the top of society. And the cracks at the top of society, as the ruling class begins to face divisions, begins to reach an impasse, gives more confidence to those people down below. And as the movement from below begins to explode, the cracks at the top of society can get bigger and bigger. That's what you see in Egypt in 2011. You see, the ruling class going into crisis and beginning to offer things to the protest movement from below. They begin to offer reforms. They begin to offer political changes. And the political changes don't quell the movement. They give more confidence to the people who are fighting. They begin to see that the ruling class are weak and divided. And so the movement begins to grow and rebel. So revolutions begin as these kind of spontaneous explosions in moments of crisis. But almost no revolution ends spontaneously. Revolutions end when one force or another imposes itself over society. And here I want to talk in conclusion for 5 minutes about how these revolutionary processes can come to a conclusion. Now, there's two central questions here. The first question is whether the working class can develop its own independent movement that can begin to impose a solution on society. Belarus gives a very interesting example of this, because if you look at Belarus, there is this powerful strike movement that's developing. But if you look at the political ideas that are in flux in Belarus, there are really two dominant sets of ideas. There's a set of ideas that says that Lukashenko and his cronies should continue to control the Belarusian economy and Belarusian politics to maintain the old order in Belarus. And there's an alternative set of ideas espoused by the liberal opposition leaders. And what they want to do is they want to turn Belarus into a society much more like Britain or France or Germany or Ukraine, with a parliamentary democracy and probably large-scale privatization of the economy. And even the workers' rebellions that have taken place in Belarus tend to accept the latter set of ideas. They accept the political ideas. They want Lukashenko to go. They want the release of the political prisoners and so on. But they stop really at the limits of what the liberal opposition are arguing. And if you listen to the most articulate and clever socialists in the region who are looking at this movement, they said, actually, what we need to do is we need to create a workers' movement that isn't just making these political demands, but is raising social and economic demands as well, and calling for opposition to privatization, for better paying conditions, and so on, because that provides a basis in which we can create an independent workers' movement that can go beyond the liberal opposition. But of course, that's only the first step. We want to go much further than that. And we want to talk about workers beginning to create from below new democratic ways of running society. And at the high points of revolutionary struggle, that's what workers do. Because once you have let's say, a general strike across a whole city or a whole country, you begin to pose the question about how is society going to be run? And then workers have to create new ways from below of running society. And that's what you see in Russia in 1917, in Chile in 1973, in the great upheaval that happened there, in Iran in 1979, and in the great revolutionary moments. But even in this context, where workers begin to create their new organs to run society from below in a democratic way, the old ideas don't simply disappear. In this kind of context, what you get is figures from the old political order, the most left-wing radical figures, running to the head of the movement and saying, you can have everything you want, but on the basis of a reformed capitalist society. And by the way, it won't be in Britain when we have a revolution. It won't be the like of Keir Starmer who is saying this. It'll be people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell who genuinely believe this stuff, because they're much more convincing because they believe you can reform capitalism. And workers listen to them, by the way, not because they're stupid, but because they're told from the moment they're born that you can't have a fundamental alternative to capitalism. And so reform begins to seem a radical alternative to the way in which people live their lives. But in a revolutionary moment, it can hold the movement back. So all these people who we work with in the struggle for reforms suddenly can begin to become a limiting factor in these revolutionary moments. And so we need political organization that pushes beyond reformism. And there's a second and final reason why you need political revolutionary organization, and that's the problem of the capitalist state. We don't just face a powerful capitalist economic class, but the power of the capitalist class is enshrined in what we call the state machinery. The state under capitalism and any other class society is not a neutral body. It's a body that defends the interests of the ruling class in that society. If you look at the key institutions of a state, I'm not talking about parliament in particular, I'm talking about the cabinet, but I'm also talking about the army, the police force, the judiciary, the civil service, the prison system, and so on. These are bodies that exist to stabilize and maintain capitalist society. And if you look at the people at the top of all of these institutions, they're people who have proved their worth to the capitalist class over a long, long period of time. And therefore, they merge into this broader capitalist class who control industry, the economy, and so on. And that's why even when you get a relatively limited challenge, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, you had a serving general in the British Army saying to the Times, a daily newspaper, if Corbyn came to power, the British Army just wouldn't stand for it. In other words, these state institutions are bitterly hostile to any challenge to the capitalist order. And therefore, we have to talk about how you break the power of the state. And this is the problem that confronts every revolution when it moves beyond a certain point. The one advantage we have, of course, is that the people who run the state machinery are not the people holding the guns, not the people actually running the civil servants or running any aspect of the state. The people who actually run the state machinery, of course, are drawn from the working class. And therefore, in these great revolutionary moments, it's possible for the state machinery to fragment, to break, and begin to create the context in which you can pose a radical alternative to a capitalist state. The point, though, is that to achieve this, you need an organized revolutionary movement that creates the conditions in which sections of the state can break away. You need a radical movement based on the working class, but you also need mechanisms that coordinate and organize this revolutionary process across the whole of society. And I will finish on this point. In other words, you need a revolutionary organization at the heart of these kind of revolutionary movements. In other words, you need a mass organization with members in every workplace, in every community, in every university, in every neighborhood, and so on, that can coordinate the revolutionary struggle and direct it towards this goal of challenging capitalism, of unleashing the power of the working class and confronting the capitalist state. Revolutionary parties can grow in a moment of revolution, but unless you build them before the revolution takes place, you can't hope to direct these energies towards this task. And that's why we in the Socialist Workers' Party harp on endlessly about the need to build the party through the struggles that we take part in. It's not that this is an alternative to building the struggle. For us, it's part of building the struggle. And when we look at these revolts happening in 2020, what we have to say is not that we despair because there aren't often these revolutionary socialist mass organizations, but we have to say we take enormous optimism from the struggles that are taking place. And we hope that as part of these struggles, a section of these movements begin to learn the lesson that we need mass socialist revolutionary organization if we are to hope to win in these revolutionary confrontations. I'll finish there. Thank you.